January 27th, 1967, 09 hours. The Kola Peninsula, northernmost tip of the Soviet Union. Senior Lieutenant Viktor Kurolyov hunches over the P-14 Tall King early warning radar scope inside a buried concrete bunker deep within the frozen forests. Outside, Arctic winds howl across the tundra at -30 degrees Celsius. Inside, the air is stagnant, thick with the smell of stale tobacco smoke, ozone, and nervous sweat. For months, Viktor has watched the same empty airspace, the rhythmic green sweep line painting nothing but occasional commercial airliners and migrating birds. His job is monotony defined, but at 09 hours, the rhythm breaks. A contact appears on the far edge of the scope, ghosting in and out near the Norwegian border. Viktor adjusts the gain, narrowing his eyes. The blip solidifies. It's not drifting like a weather balloon. It's not cruising like a bomber. It's slicing through the grid lines with a velocity that makes Viktor tap the glass, certain his equipment has malfunctioned. He grabs his headset. Target acquired. Sector 47. Altitude undetermined. Speed. He pauses. He checks the calculation again. His voice trembles slightly. Speed is Mach 3. Repeat. Target velocity is Mach 3. The room goes silent. In 1967, Mach 3 is not a speed for aircraft. It's a speed for missiles, for things that explode, not things that fly. The commander rushes to the station, leaning over Viktor's shoulder. Is it a missile launch? Are the Americans firing? Negative, Comrade Colonel. It is not on a ballistic trajectory. It is maneuvering, maintaining altitude, turning. For the next 40 minutes, the men in the bunker watch in paralyzed confusion as the target traces a lazy, arrogant loop along the edge of Soviet airspace. It doesn't slow down. It doesn't descend to cool off. It stays pinned at 80,000 feet, a height where the air is so thin it's practically a vacuum, moving faster than a rifle bullet. How could the Americans build a machine that breaks every law of physics the Soviet engineering elite understands?
Senior Lieutenant Viktor Kurolyov, 28 years old, was born in Leningrad in 1939, just months before the Nazi invasion that would kill 1.5 million of his city's residents. He grew up in the rubble, watching the adults rebuild a shattered empire. He joined the Air Defense Forces, the PVO Strony, in 1958, trained at the Zhukovsky Air Force Engineering Academy, and became one of the Soviet Union's most skilled radar operators. His specialty, identifying aircraft by their radar signature alone. The way the blip moves, how it turns, the rate of climb, these details tell a story. Is it a B-52 bomber, a reconnaissance U-2, a commercial 707? Viktor can tell the difference in seconds. But this morning, nothing in his training prepared him for what appeared on his scope. The P-14 is a Soviet marvel of early warning technology. Deployed in 1960, it can detect aircraft at ranges exceeding 600 kilometers. The system consists of massive antenna arrays that rotate slowly, painting the sky with radio waves and listening for echoes. Viktor sits before a circular cathode ray tube display, 12 inches in diameter, glowing ghostly green in the dim bunker. The sweep line rotates clockwise every 10 seconds. When it intersects with a target, a bright blip appears. The distance from the center indicates range. The angle indicates bearing, but the P-14 has limitations. It struggles with low-flying targets due to ground clutter. It can be fooled by weather patterns and flocks of birds. Most critically, it cannot accurately measure the altitude of extremely high-flying targets. By January 1967, the Cold War is at its peak. The Cuban Missile Crisis is a fresh memory. American bombers armed with nuclear weapons circle the Arctic 24 hours a day, ready to strike within minutes. The Soviet Union has invested billions of rubles constructing a vast network of radar stations, missile sites, and interceptor bases. The Kola Peninsula, where Viktor is stationed, is strategically critical. It sits adjacent to NATO member Norway, home to American reconnaissance aircraft, constantly probing Soviet defenses. Every day, Viktor tracks these flights. They approach, turn away, approach again, testing response times, mapping radar coverage. But they never enter Soviet airspace. They never fly this fast, and they certainly never fly at 80,000 feet.
Viktor understands basic aerodynamics. At Mach 3, 3 times the speed of sound, approximately 3,500 kilometers per hour, the air resistance generates friction heat intense enough to melt aluminum. Standard jet engines work by compressing air, mixing it with fuel, and igniting it. But at Mach 3, the air entering the engine is already moving so fast it creates shock waves that choke the engine, causing catastrophic failure. Soviet engineers had built fast aircraft before. The MiG-21 could reach Mach 2 in short bursts, but sustaining Mach 3 for 40 minutes as this target is doing, Viktor knows that's impossible with current technology, unless the Americans have developed something entirely new. The colonel barks orders. "Scramble interceptors. I want visual identification, now." 2 MiG-21 fighters are launched from a nearby airfield. They're light, fast, and flown by the regiment's best pilots. As they climb, straining their engines to reach their service ceiling of 60,000 feet, the target simply exists above them, untouchable. The Soviet pilots look up through their canopies into the dark purple sky. They report seeing a silver streak, a glint of sunlight far above, moving with a serenity that feels insulting. They push their throttles to maximum, dumping fuel into their afterburner. But their engines begin to overheat. Warning lights flash. They're forced to break off, diving back into thicker air to save their jets from disintegrating. The target doesn't react. It doesn't evade. It simply continues its patrol, burning a line across the sky. Viktor watches the intercept fail. He types his report with trembling fingers, knowing it will reach the Kremlin within 48 hours. The question at the end of his report is simple but terrifying. How are they doing this?
The radar tapes from the Kola Peninsula arrive at the Central Aerohydrodynamics Institute, TSAGI, in a leather briefcase, handcuffed to a courier's wrist. TSAGI is the brain trust of Soviet aviation, where the finest minds in the communist world write and rewrite the laws of aerodynamics. A committee is formed immediately. Lead propulsion engineers, aerodynamicists, and intelligence officers from the GRU Military Intelligence Agency. The atmosphere in the conference room is not one of scientific curiosity, it's defensive panic. The data presents a terrifying picture. The target maintained Mach 3.2 over 3,500 kilometers per hour for sustained periods. This duration is the anomaly keeping engineers awake at night. Senior engineer Grigory Petrov, 52, a veteran of the Great Patriotic War who helped design the MiG-15, stares at the flight path data. "It's impossible," he mutters. "If they're using standard turbojet engines, the turbine inlet temperature would exceed the melting point of known alloys. The engine should have liquefied 10 minutes into the flight. In a standard turbojet engine, air is sucked in the front, compressed by spinning blades, mixed with kerosene, and ignited. This explosion shoots out the back, pushing the plane forward. Simple enough at subsonic speeds. But at Mach 3, the air ramming into the front of the engine isn't a breeze. It's a solid wall of pressure. This compression heats the air instantly. Before the air even touches the engine's internal compressor, it's already over 400 degrees Celsius. When you try to compress air that's already superheated, the metal turbine blades soften. They stretch. Eventually, they melt or shatter, turning the engine into a grenade of shrapnel. Soviet engineers had experienced this firsthand. Their own high-speed interceptor prototypes, like the A-152, were brutes.
They achieved speed through raw thrust, fighting the air, vibrating violently, guzzling fuel and destroying their own engines after just a few minutes of supersonic flight. But this American ghost was dancing with the shockwaves, cruising for over an hour without apparent difficulty. "They've done it," declares Colonel Yevgeny Sokolov from GRU Intelligence. "The Americans have built a nuclear-powered aircraft." This had been a Soviet fear since the 1950s. A nuclear reactor wouldn't need to burn fuel in the traditional sense. It could heat air indefinitely, explaining the unlimited range and high speed. But radiation detectors on Soviet border patrols had picked up nothing. No trail of radioactive isotopes, no glowing exhaust. The theory is discarded, though the fear remains. "Perhaps it's a rocket glider," suggests another engineer, "similar to the experimental X-15, dropped from a massive bomber, lights a rocket motor to dash across the border, then glides back." But the radar tracking contradicts this. The object didn't glide. It accelerated out of turns. It climbed while at speed. A glider loses energy. This machine was generating it at will. The meeting ends without conclusions. Only more questions. The Soviet Air Force receives new orders. Visual identification at any cost. They need to see the engines, the exhaust, the airframe. They need photographs. By 1968, the Soviets have deployed their answer to this threat, the MiG-25 Foxbat. It's a masterpiece of brute force engineering. Two massive Tumansky R-15 engines with a cockpit strapped between them. On paper, it can reach Mach 2.8. Maybe Mach 3 if the pilot is willing to wreck the plane. Captain Alexander Bezhevets, 31, is one of the best MiG-25 pilots in the Soviet Air Force. He's stationed at Wernichin Air Base, just north of Berlin. He's been briefed on the target. He's been told it's a reconnaissance aircraft, call sign Blackbird, capable of speeds exceeding Mach 3. On June 4, 1968, at 14:22 hours, Bezhevets receives the scramble order. A high-speed target has been detected over the Baltic Sea, heading southeast. He sprints to his MiG-25, already fueled and armed. Bezhevets engages afterburners. The massive Tumansky engines roar, each producing 24,700 pounds of thrust. The MiG-25 accelerates violently through the sound barrier. At 40,000 feet, he's doing Mach 2.5. He looks at his instruments. Engine temperature gauges climbing into the red zone, overheat warning lights flickering on. He has strict orders. Do not exceed Mach 2.8 for more than 3 minutes. Beyond that, the engines will suck in their own compressor blades. But the target is still above him, and crucially, it's pulling away. Bezhevets makes a decision. He overrides the safety limiters. He pushes the throttle past the detent, dumping raw fuel into the tailpipe. The MiG-25 hits Mach 3.0. The aircraft screams. The paint on the nose cone begins to blister from friction heat. The cockpit glass radiates warmth like an open oven door, even through his gloves. And then he sees it. Through the haze of high altitude, he spots the SR-37. It's not vibrating. It's not struggling. It looks like a silver dart suspended in motionless oil, a dark, sleek wedge moving with eerie smoothness. He watches the exhaust plumes of the American plane. They tighten, forming perfect glowing diamonds, shock diamonds trailing behind the engines. Physics textbook perfection. The SR-37 doesn't bank away. It doesn't dive. It simply accelerates. It walks away from the MiG-25 as if Bezhevets is standing still. His own engines begin to surge violently. Bang, bang, bang. Compressor stalls that sound like cannon fire. The aircraft shudders. He chops the throttle and dives, praying his aircraft doesn't disintegrate. When Bezhevets lands back at Wernichin, the ground crew is horrified. The engines of the MiG-25 are destroyed. The turbines are fused together. The heat was so intense it warped the steel fuselage. The aircraft flew at Mach 3 for 5 minutes. It effectively killed itself to do it. The Blackbird? It flew for hours. While Soviet engineers chase ghosts, the answer to their riddle sits behind a chain-link fence at Lockheed's Advanced Development Projects Division, better known as the Skunk Works. The man running the show is Clarence Kelly Johnson, 52, a legend in aeronautical engineering. He designed the P-38 Lightning, the F-104 Starfire, and the U-2 spy plane. Now he faces his greatest challenge: build an aircraft that can fly at Mach 3.2 for hours without melting. Johnson and his team realize early on what the Soviets are just beginning to suspect. Standard jet engines are useless for this mission. At Mach 3, air pressure and heat destroy conventional turbojets. The American solution isn't to build a stronger engine that fights the heat, it's to build an engine that changes its own anatomy mid-flight. They select the Pratt & Whitney J-58. On a test stand, sitting still, it's a powerful but fairly standard turbojet. It screams, burns fuel, generates thrust. But the magic isn't in the engine itself. It's in the massive structure built in front of the engine. If you look closely at the SR-71, you'll see two giant sharp cones protruding from the engine inlets. These aren't just aerodynamic fairings, they're the secret weapon. These cones, called inlet spikes, are movable. They're controlled by a complex analog computer, a mechanical brain of gears and cams that can slide the spike forward and backward up to 26 inches.
Here's how it works. When the Blackbird sits on the runway or flies at subsonic speeds, the spike is locked forward. Air flows in smoothly, the compressor spins. The engine works like a normal jet: suck, squeeze, bang, blow. But as the pilot pushes the throttle forward and crosses Mach 1, then Mach 2, the computer wakes up. It begins to retract the spike deeper into the engine throat. At Mach 3, the air hitting the front of the plane is a violent supersonic shockwave. The retracted spike is positioned perfectly to capture this shockwave and trap it inside the inlet. Instead of letting that shockwave destroy the engine, the shape of the inlet slows the air down from Mach 3 to subsonic speeds in a fraction of a second. This massive reduction in speed converts the kinetic energy of the air into pressure, immense pressure. The air isn't just entering the engine, it's being rammed into it with the force of a hydraulic press. Then comes the second trick, the one Soviet pilots couldn't see. Inside the engine housing, Johnson and the Pratt & Whitney engineers installed a series of bypass tubes. These are essentially trapdoors. When the pressure becomes too high and the air too hot for the delicate turbine blades to handle, the engine opens these doors. The massive rush of supercompressed air doesn't go through the core of the engine, it goes around it. It bypasses the compressor, the burner cans, and the turbine entirely. It's piped directly into the afterburner at the rear of the plane. At that moment, the J-58 ceases to be a turbojet. It becomes a ramjet. In a ramjet, you don't need a compressor because the speed of the aircraft compresses the air for you. The engine core, the complex spinning machinery, is reduced to a simple pump, just keeping the flame lit. The real thrust comes from that bypassed air mixed with fuel and ignited in the massive tailpipe.
This explains the phenomenon Soviet radar operators witnessed. In a normal jet, the faster you go, the harder the engine has to work to suck in air, and the more fuel it burns. But in the SR-71, the faster it flies, the harder the air rams itself into the engine. The engine actually has to do less work at Mach 3 than it does at Mach 1. The efficiency goes up with speed. At Mach 3.2, the inlet design, that spike and those bypass doors, generates 80% of the total thrust. The engines are essentially coasting, being pushed along by the sheer force of the air they're swallowing. The Americans turned the enemy, the crushing air pressure, into the propulsion source. To fuel this beast, they couldn't use normal kerosene, which would boil and explode in the tanks at those temperatures. They developed JP7, a fuel so stable you could drop a lit match into a bucket of it and it wouldn't ignite. To light it, they had to inject a chemical called triethylborane, or TEB, which explodes on contact with air, creating that signature green flash you see in footage of the Blackbird starting up.
The Yom Kippur War is raging. The Soviet Union has deployed MiG-25 Foxbats to Egypt to counter Israeli Phantom jets and American reconnaissance flights. Soviet pilot, call sign 831, is vectored to intercept a target moving north at Mach 3.2. This is the confrontation the Kremlin has been waiting for. The MiG-25 is fully fueled, armed, and stripped for speed. The pilot engages afterburners. The massive Tumansky engines roar, dumping gallons of fuel per second. The MiG-25 accelerates through the sound barrier, past Mach 2. The acceleration is violent. The aircraft shudders as it punches through the dense lower atmosphere. At 40,000 feet, he's doing Mach 2.5. He looks at his instruments. Engine temperature gauges climbing into the red zone, overheat warning lights flickering on. He has strict orders: do not exceed Mach 2.8 for more than 3 minutes. But the target is still above him. Pulling away, he overrides the safety limiters. He pushes the throttle past the detent. The MiG-25 hits Mach 3.2. The plane is screaming. Paint on the nose cone blisters from friction heat. The cockpit glass radiates heat. He spots the SR-71 through the haze. It's not vibrating. It's not struggling. It looks like a silver dart suspended in motionless air. And then he witnesses the impossible. The exhaust plumes of the American plane change. They tighten into perfect glowing diamonds trailing behind the engines. The SR-71 doesn't bank away. It simply accelerates. It walks away from the MiG-25. The Soviet pilot watches, helpless, as the American plane vanishes into the curvature of the earth. His own engines begin to surge violently. Bang, bang, bang. Compressor stalls. He chops the throttle and dives, praying his aircraft doesn't disintegrate. When he lands back in Egypt, the ground crew is horrified. The engines are destroyed. The turbines fused together. The heat warped the steel fuselage. The aircraft flew at Mach 3 for 5 minutes. It killed itself to do it.
The report of this incident reaches the desk of the chief designer at the Mikoyan Gurevich Bureau in Moscow. Intelligence reports have finally pieced together the mechanism of the J-58 engine. They lay the schematics of the American engine next to the wreckage of their own MiG-25 engines. The realization is a gut punch to Soviet ego. They're not fighting the pressure, a senior analyst reportedly says, staring at the diagrams of the bypass tubes. They're surfing on it. The Soviets now understand, while their pilots risk their lives pushing a wall of air out of the way, the Americans built a machine that swallows the wall. They understand that the SR-71's engine efficiency increases with speed. At Mach 3, the SR-71 burns less fuel per mile than it does at Mach 2. It's in its natural habitat. The MiG-25, by comparison, is drowning.
But the revelation gets worse. To build a plane that can survive continuous heat, 500 degrees Celsius on the skin, 1,000 in the exhaust, you cannot use aluminum. Aluminum turns to soft putty at those speeds. You need titanium. The Soviet Union sits on the world's largest reserves of titanium ore. It's a strategic metal, strictly controlled. They assumed the Americans, who have very little domestic titanium, would be forced to use heavy steel like the MiG-25 or give up. Then comes the final humiliating piece of the puzzle. The KGB discovers a network of shell companies, dummy corporations set up in third world countries, supposedly buying titanium for pizza ovens and bicycle frames. The paper trail leads back to the CIA. The silence in Kremlin meeting rooms is deafening. The Soviet Union had sold the United States the very metal used to build the spy plane, now humiliating them. They mined the ore, refined it, and shipped it to the enemy, who used it to build a fuselage capable of withstanding the heat that melted the MiG-25. The impossible engine was housed in a stolen body. The futility of the Soviet response is now clear. They built the MiG-25 Foxbat as a counter. It's a terrifying machine in its own right, fast, armed with massive missiles, rugged, but it's a point defense interceptor. It can sprint to the corner of the block, bark, and come back.
Over the course of its service life, spanning 3 decades, over 4,000 missiles were fired at the SR-71 Blackbird. They were fired from North Vietnam, North Korea, Libya, and the borders of the Soviet Union. Every single one of them failed. The Blackbird, the plane that broke the rules of thermodynamics, was never touched by enemy fire. This statistic is not just testament to pilot skill, it's mathematical proof of an engineering checkmate. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union had effectively bankrupted itself trying to build a roof over its empire. They constructed thousands of S-200 and S-300 missile sites. They produced over 1,000 MiG-25 interceptors and over 500 advanced MiG-31 aircraft. They trained entire generations of radar operators to look for the fast mover. The economic disparity was staggering. The United States built only 32 SR-71 aircraft, a tiny fleet. Yet this handful of black jets forced the Soviet Union to spend tens of billions of rubles on a defense network that, practically speaking, did not work against the primary target. The J-58 engine wasn't just a propulsion system. It was a symbol of the widening gap between 2 distinct ideologies of innovation. The Soviet approach was logical, robust, and industrial. They looked at the problem, we need to go fast, and applied more power. Bigger engines, steel frames, stronger rockets, a philosophy of brute force. It produced the MiG-25, a magnificent machine in its own right, but fundamentally limited by the materials it was made of. The American approach, epitomized by Kelly Johnson and the Skunk Works, was different. It was experimental, expensive, and seemingly reckless. They looked at the problem and decided to change the physics of the environment. They realized that fighting the atmosphere was a losing battle, so they redesigned the engine to feed on the violence of the speed. They built a plane that leaked fuel on the runway because the panels were designed to fit only when expanded by heat. They built a plane that grew 6 inches longer in flight. They built a plane that required a separate starter cart with 2 Buick V8 engines just to spin the turbines up to speed. To Soviet engineers who prioritized reliability and mass production, the SR-71 was an abomination. Too complex, too fragile, too demanding. It shouldn't have worked, but it did. The psychological impact on Soviet military leadership cannot be overstated. For 25 years, they lived with the knowledge that the Americans could fly over their most sensitive installations, take high-resolution photos of their backyard, and be home in time for dinner, and there was absolutely nothing the Red Army could do about it. It created a culture of paranoia. It forced them to hide their best secrets in bunkers, knowing the sky was always watching. It accelerated the collapse of their economy as they desperately tried to close a technological gap, widening every year. When the Iron Curtain finally fell in 1991, American pilots and Soviet pilots met face-to-face at air shows and conferences. The old adversaries shared vodka and stories. The Soviet pilots, men who had flown the MiG-25 and MiG-31, asked the Americans the same question over and over. How did you keep the engines from melting? When the Americans explained the bypass tubes, the moving spikes, and the thermal expansion joints, the Russians were often silent. They understood the physics, but they were baffled by the audacity. They marveled that a government would approve such a risky, insane design. The SR-71 was retired in 1990, not because the Soviets caught it, but because satellites and budget cuts finally did what 4,000 missiles could not. Today, the remaining Blackbirds sit in museums. They're cold, quiet, and they no longer leak fuel. But if you stand next to the massive inlet of a J-58 engine, you're looking at the artifact that won the Cold War. Not with a bang, but with a sonic boom. It stands as a reminder of a time when engineers stared at the impossible thermal wall of Mach 3 flight, and instead of turning back, they decided to simply open a door and walk right through it. The Soviets spent decades looking for a weapon to kill the beast, never realizing that the beast was powered by the very thing they were trying to protect, the air itself. Viktor Kurolyov, that young radar operator on the Kola Peninsula, retired in 1989. He never forgot that morning in January 1967 when the impossible appeared on his scope. In interviews decades later, he would shake his head and smile. "We thought we were watching a weapon. We were watching a miracle." The J-58 engine, the impossible engine, proved that the greatest victories in war are not always won with more firepower, but with minds brave enough to rewrite the rules entirely.
If this story fascinated you, give this video a thumbs up. It helps the algorithm show this to others who love forgotten military history. These stories of Cold War engineering deserve to be remembered, not just for the technology, but for what they reveal about human ingenuity under pressure. Drop a comment and tell me, what other Cold War secrets do you think should be uncovered? The MiG-25 defection? The Polyus space weapon? The Soviet doomsday device? Let me know, and I'll dig into the declassified files. And subscribe, because next week we're diving into the story of the only pilot who ever defected with a MiG-25 and how the CIA tore it apart bolt by bolt.